All right, so today we are going to be diving into something a little different, something a little spicy. We're going to be unpacking a vintage sex manual.
Ooh, vintage, you say? That's intriguing. What era are we talking about here?
Well, I'm not going to give away the exact year just yet, but let's just say it offers some fascinating insights into how people used to think about, getting busy.
I can imagine those older manuals, they often reflect the social norms and anxieties of their time,
Yeah.
which can be quite illuminating to look back on.
Yeah, and this one is no exception. It covers everything from the basics like erogenous zones and all that to some, shall we say, more creative techniques for lasting longer.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. We've also got sections on hygiene advice for first-timers and even a list of sex facts that we'll definitely need to examine closely.
Okay, sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
It
Where
does.
should we start?
Well, the manual jumps right in with descriptions of erogenous zones, and it's very straightforward, almost clinical in its approach.
Hmm. Yeah, that clinical tone was pretty common back then. I imagine it was intended to be educational, but it could also come across as a bit impersonal, don't you think?
Yeah, a little bit. It's like they're trying to demystify sex by turning it into a science lesson.
Exactly. But, even with that clinical approach, these older manuals often assumed a certain level of existing knowledge.
Yeah.
For someone completely new to sexual exploration, some of the terms and concepts might have been confusing.
That's a good point. It's like they're speaking to an audience that already has a basic understanding of anatomy and sexual function.
Right.
But for someone who's completely inexperienced, it could be a bit overwhelming.
Absolutely. Which is why having open conversations and seeking out reliable information from various sources is so important.
For sure. Speaking of reliable information, let's move on to the techniques for lasting longer. This is where things get a little interesting.
Okay.
They have this whole section on using mind control.
Mind control, do tell.
Well, basically, it suggests thinking about non-sexual things to avoid, finishing too quickly. Things like picturing your grandma doing mental math. It's like they're suggesting a mental distraction technique.
Hmm. That's a curious approach. While the effectiveness of picturing your grandma is debatable, it does touch on the mental aspect of sexual performance, which is often overlooked.
Yeah, it's like they're acknowledging that anxiety and overthinking can definitely play a role in premature, let's say, culmination.
Exactly. And that idea of mental distraction actually has some roots in mindfulness techniques. Focusing on your breath or bodily sensations can help to calm the nervous system and stay present, which could theoretically be helpful in managing performance anxiety.
Interesting. So maybe there's some modern day relevance to this mind control technique after all.
Perhaps it's all about finding what works for you and your partner.
Right now, the manual also mentions some other techniques like using condoms, experimenting with different positions, and even the withdrawal method.
Oh, yeah.
It kind of throws everything at the wall and sees what sticks.
Ah, yes, the classic withdrawal method. It's important to note that its effectiveness really depends on perfect use, which is quite difficult to achieve. In fact, studies show that with typical use, about 22% of couples who rely solely on withdrawal will experience an unplanned pregnancy within a year.
Wow, that's a pretty significant number. So definitely not the most reliable method, to say the least.
Definitely not. But it's interesting to see how this manual presents a range of options,
Mm.
some more effective than others. It highlights the importance of doing your research and choosing methods that align with your own needs and risk tolerance.
Right. It's like having a menu of options, but you need to be informed about the potential side effects before making your selection. Now, one thing that stood out to me as a positive is how much the manual emphasizes pleasing your partner. There's a lot of talk about foreplay focusing on the woman's pleasure first and open communication about needs. What did you make of that?
I found that emphasis on mutual satisfaction to be quite refreshing, especially considering that many older manuals tended to focus primarily on male pleasure. This one, at least in that regard, promotes a more balanced and egalitarian approach to intimacy.
Yeah, it's not just about one person getting theirs. It's about making sure both partners feel good and have a fulfilling experience.
Absolutely. It's a collaborative effort, not a solo performance.
Well said. Now, I have to admit, there was one piece of advice that made me chuckle. It's in the section on faking orgasms, and it just says, ladies, don't forget to see you in them.
Oh my, that's quite direct. While the phrasing is amusing, it does unintentionally touch on a sensitive topic, the pressure some women feel to perform, and the potential harm of faking orgasms.
Exactly. While it's great to encourage enthusiasm and expressiveness, faking it ultimately undermines genuine intimacy and communication.
You're absolutely right. Honesty and open communication about what feels good and what doesn't is essential for a truly fulfilling sexual connection.
Now, the manual also delves into some more general advice. Some of it's practical and some of it's a little questionable.
The classic sex manual combo. What kind of advice are we talking about?
Well, for example, there's a whole section on hygiene, which, is important, but it goes into a lot of detail about showering, grooming, and basically presenting yourself in a certain way.
I see. It's interesting how even back then there was this emphasis on conforming to certain standards of attractiveness.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that those standards are often subjective
Mm.
and can vary greatly depending on cultural and personal preferences.
Totally. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, as they say. But then there's this line that really caught my attention. The first time will probably suck, just straight up, no sugarcoating.
A rather blunt assessment. But it does speak to the importance of managing expectations.
Mm.
The reality is that sex, especially for beginners, is often a learning process. It can be awkward, fumbling, and yes, maybe even a little disappointing at first, but with communication, patience, and a willingness to explore it, can and often does get much better.
I'm glad you brought up communication because the manual also mentions the potential downsides of watching too much porn. It basically says that porn can create unrealistic expectations and pressure to perform in certain ways. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a valid point. Pornography can be a source of fantasy and entertainment,
Yeah.
but it's important to remember that it's not necessarily a reflection of real-life sexual experiences.
Mm.
The focus is often on performance and visual stimulation, which can lead to unrealistic expectations and pressure to conform to certain ideals.
Yeah, it's easy to fall into the trap of comparing yourself to what you see on screen and feeling like you're not measuring up. But the truth is, everyone's different, and what matters most is finding what you and your partner enjoy, not trying to imitate someone else's performance.
Precisely, it's about discovering your own unique desires and preferences and communicating those openly and honestly with your partner.
Okay, and now for the part I've been eagerly anticipating, the sex facts section. This is where things get really wild. The manual throws out all sorts of claims, some more believable than others. Are you ready for a little fact-checking fun?
Absolutely, I love a good myth-busting session.
All right, buckle up. Here's a rapid-fire round of some of the most surprising facts from the manual. Sex can cure sickness. A high percentage of people use their phones during sex, and hookups lead to marriage. What do you make of all that?
Okay, let's break these down one by one. The idea that sex can cure sickness is an interesting one. While it's obviously not a cure-all, there is some truth to the idea that sex can have positive effects on our physical and mental well-being.
So there's a kernel of truth there, but not a full-blown medical miracle. What about the phone thing? Is everyone really that glued to their screens?
Well, the claim that a high percentage of people use their phones during sex is a bit more concerning. While there are no definitive statistics on this, it does reflect a growing trend of technology interfering with our personal lives, including our intimate moments.
It makes you wonder, are we so tethered to our devices that we can't even disconnect for something as, well, intimate as sex?
It's a valid concern. It raises questions about how we prioritize connection and presence in our relationships in this digital age.
Okay, last one. Hookups leading to marriage. Is that just wishful thinking, or is there some data to back that up?
The idea that hookups can lead to marriage is an interesting one. While it's certainly not the most common path to matrimony, it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. Some studies have shown that a significant percentage of married couples started their relationships with a casual hookup.
So it's not a guaranteed recipe for marriage, but it's not impossible either.
Exactly. It just goes to show that relationships can evolve in unexpected ways.
So it seems like this manual is a mixed bag of truth exaggeration and maybe a little bit of wishful thinking. It's definitely entertaining, but it's important to take it with a grain of salt, right?
Absolutely. Like any source of information, especially when it comes to something as personal and nuanced as sex-critical thinking, is essential. It's about discerning fact from fiction, understanding the context, and considering multiple perspectives.
Well said. Now, the manual ends with a section on positions, which is pretty standard fare for this type of guide. But it got me thinking about what's not in the manual and what might be even more important than specific techniques or positions. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great observation. While this manual attempts to be comprehensive, it only scratches the surface of what constitutes a healthy and fulfilling sexual experience.
Right. It's like they're giving you the ingredients, but not the recipe for a truly satisfying and connected experience.
Exactly. And that's where the real learning begins, by engaging in open and honest communication with our partners, exploring our own desires and boundaries, and seeking out information from credible sources.
Totally. It's about going beyond the mechanics and delving into the emotional and relational aspects of sex.
Precisely. And those aspects are just as important, if not more so, than the physical techniques themselves.
Yeah.
It really is. And speaking of those emotional and relational aspects, I think it's worth noting that this manual, while advocating for mutual pleasure, still frames sex in a rather heteronormative way.
Oh, absolutely. It very much assumes a traditional male-female dynamic with little to no mention of other sexual orientations or relationship styles.
Exactly. And for someone exploring their sexuality outside of that traditional framework, this manual wouldn't offer much guidance or representation.
It's like they're presenting one very specific view of sex and relationships, assuming it applies to everyone.
Right, and that highlights the importance of seeking out diverse perspectives and resources that reflect the wide spectrum of human sexuality.
Well said. It's all about expanding our understanding and embracing the beautiful complexity of human connection.
And speaking of embracing complexity, you mentioned the manual ends with an extensive section on positions.
Oh yeah, it's got a whole Kama Sutra-inspired menu of options, but what struck me is how the descriptions are very focused on the physical mechanics, almost like a set of instructions.
It's interesting how the language used reflects a somewhat detached approach to intimacy. It's all about achieving a specific outcome rather than exploring the emotional and sensual aspects of the experience.
It's like insert tab A into slot B and voila, you've got sex, but there's so much more to it than that, right?
Absolutely. The manual seems to operate under the assumption that sex is a purely physical act with a clear goal in mind. But we know that human sexuality is far more complex and multifaceted than that.
Right, it's about connection, intimacy,
Hmm.
pleasure, vulnerability. It's not just a series of steps to follow.
And this brings up a crucial point, that the manual perhaps unintentionally highlights the importance of communication and individual preferences. While it offers a range of positions, it doesn't acknowledge that what might be enjoyable for one person could be uncomfortable or even unpleasant for another.
Exactly. It's like assuming everyone likes the same type of food. Just because a certain position is described in the manual doesn't mean it's going to be everyone's cup of tea.
And that's where open communication with your partner is crucial, talking about what feels good, what doesn't, and being willing to experiment and explore together.
It's about finding what works for you as a couple, not feeling pressured to conform to someone else's idea of what's right or normal.
Exactly. And that sense of open communication extends beyond just physical preferences. It's also about discussing boundaries, desires, and any fears or anxieties you might have.
You know, it's funny how this manual, while trying to be this ultimate guide to sex, actually reveals a lot about the anxieties and assumptions people had back then.
What's interesting is how some of those anxieties persist even today. The manual talks about insecurities around body image, performance, anxiety, and the pressure to please your partner. These are all themes that are still very relevant in contemporary discussions about sex and relationships.
It's like some things never change, right? No matter how much society evolves, we still grapple with these fundamental human concerns.
Absolutely. And that underscores the need for ongoing dialogue and education about sex and relationships. We need to create spaces where people feel comfortable asking questions, exploring their desires, and challenging harmful stereotypes.
This manual, in a strange way, actually provides a good starting point for those conversations. It's like a time capsule that allows us to see how far we've come, but also how much work still needs to be done.
I couldn't agree more. By examining the past, we can gain a better understanding of the present and pave the way for a more inclusive and informed future when it comes to sex and relationships.
Well said. It's like that saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But hopefully, with more open conversations and a willingness to challenge outdated ideas, we can create a more positive and empowering sexual landscape for everyone.
I'm optimistic that we're moving in the right direction.
Me too. It's all about learning, growing, and supporting each other along the way. Now, before we wrap up our exploration of this quirky and insightful sex manual, there was one more thing that really jumped out at me. It's how the language often portrays sex as a conquest, with the man being the ruler of the bedroom.
Yeah, you're right. That kind of language definitely reflects some outdated gender roles and power dynamics. It presents sex as a performance, with the man in charge and the woman there to please him.
It almost feels like there's a script to follow with specific expectations for how each person should behave.
And that can be really limiting, right? It leaves no room for individual expression, exploration, or genuine connection. It also perpetuates harmful stereotypes that can create pressure and anxiety for both partners.
It's like everyone's trying to play a role instead of just being themselves and figuring out what feels good together.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of communication, consent, and mutual respect. Those are the foundations of a healthy and fulfilling sexual relationship.
Well said. It's not about following a script. It's about writing your own story together.
And being open to revising and rewriting that story as you both grow and evolve.
I love that it's about embracing the journey, not just focusing on the destination.
And remember, the best guide is open and honest communication with your partner, coupled with a willingness to learn and explore together.
Couldn't agree more. It's about throwing out the rule book, being curious, and having fun along the way.
While always keeping consent, respect, and open communication as the non-negotiables.
Absolutely. Okay. I think we've officially squeezed every last drop of insight out of this intriguing and at times perplexing sex manual. What are your final thoughts as we bring this deep dive to a close?
Well, I think this exploration has highlighted the importance of approaching any source of information, especially one about sex, with a critical and discerning eye. It's about recognizing the cultural context, understanding the potential biases, and most importantly, prioritizing open communication with our partners. Sex is not a one-size-fits-all experience. It's a journey of exploration, communication, and shared pleasure.
Beautifully put. It's about finding what works for you and your partner and having fun along the way.
And never stop learning, exploring, and challenging the status quo.
Well, folks, that's a wrap on our deep dive into the world of vintage sex manuals. We hope you've enjoyed the laughs, the insights, and maybe even the occasional cringeworthy moment. Remember, when it comes to sex and relationships, there's no right or wrong answer. It's about finding what works for you and your partner, communicating openly, and having fun along the way.
And never be afraid to question, explore, and communicate openly with your partner.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay sexy.
Until next time, keep exploring, and remember, pleasure is a journey, not a destination.
It's interesting how even with all its outdated advice and assumptions, this manual still manages to touch on some universal truths about human sexuality.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a reminder that while the cultural context surrounding sex might change, the core human desires and anxieties, often remain pretty consistent.
No matter what era you're in, everyone wants to feel desired and attractive, and everyone experiences those moments of self-doubt or worry about performance. It's all part of the human experience.
Absolutely. And recognizing that shared humanity, I think, is key to fostering healthier and more compassionate conversations about sex.
Right.
It's about moving away from judgment and shame and creating a space where people can, feel comfortable exploring their sexuality and asking questions.
Yeah, for sure. This deep dive has definitely been a fascinating journey into the past and present of sexual attitudes.
It really has, and it's highlighted the importance of critical thinking, open communication, and ongoing education when it comes to navigating the complex and ever-evolving landscape of sex and relationships.
Yeah, for our listeners out there who might be feeling a little overwhelmed or confused by, all the conflicting information out there, what's one key takeaway you'd want them to remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that there's no one right way to experience sex or relationships. What matters most is finding what works for you and your partner, communicating openly and honestly, and respecting each other's boundaries and desires.
Such a great reminder. It's all about finding what feels good, both physically and emotionally, and, creating a space where you can explore and connect with your partner in a way that's authentic and fulfilling.
Exactly. And remember, that journey of exploration is ongoing. As you grow and evolve, your needs and desires may change. And that's perfectly normal. The key is to keep those lines of communication open and be willing to adjust and adapt along the way.
I love that, embracing the evolution.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of vintage sex manuals, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I would encourage everyone to approach sex and relationships with a sense of curiosity, playfulness, and open-mindedness. Don't be afraid to ask questions, experiment, and learn from your experiences. And remember, the most important guide you have is your own intuition and the open communication you have with your partner.
Beautifully said. A huge thank you to you for joining us on this insightful and often hilarious adventure.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for diving in with us. We hope you've enjoyed the ride and maybe even learned a thing or two along the way. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay sexy.